The morning sky over Romania shimmered like molten glass. It was August 1st, 1943. The sun was still climbing when the horizon began to hum, a deep, unnatural vibration that made birds fall silent and men look up. From the distant haze, they appeared, hundreds of dark shapes, moving in perfect formation. At first, the German sentries thought they were clouds. But clouds don't growl like thunder. Clouds don't drop fire. In minutes, calm skies turned to chaos. The oil field of Ploiești, Hitler's lifeline, erupted beneath a storm of bombs. Black columns of smoke twisted upward until they merged with the clouds themselves. The smell of burning oil carried for miles. Soldiers shouted into radios that no longer mattered. The ground was splitting apart under the rain of steel. Above them, hundreds of aircraft moved as one, engines howling, wings trembling. The B-24 Liberators. That morning, 177 of them roared over Axis territory in one of the most daring and tragic missions of the war, Operation Tidal Wave. The Germans, and even some Americans, had never seen anything quite like it. From below, they looked like flying factories, huge four-engine machines that dwarfed the fighters trying to reach them. When one was hit, another filled the gap. The sky was too full to breathe. But the story of this beast, the bomber that left the Germans stunned and the skies burning, didn't begin in Romania. It began 4 years earlier in a quiet California factory when war was still a rumor. In 1939, the United States Army Air Corps sent out a request for a long-range bomber. They needed something new, something that could reach across continents. The B-17 Flying Fortress was already admired for its strength, but its range was limited. America's strategists knew that the next war would be fought in distant skies, and they couldn't afford to fight it half the way there. Consolidated aircraft companies stepped up to the challenge. They promised a design that could fly faster, higher, and farther than anything that had ever taken off before. The engineers didn't set out to make it elegant. They set out to make it effective. The result was the B-24 Liberator. Square wings, boxy fuselage, and a belly big enough to carry death across oceans. It wasn't pretty. One pilot later joked. If it could fly, it could win a beauty contest against a barn. But that awkward shape, especially the high Davis wing, gave it an edge. It could fly faster and farther than the B-17, while carrying more bombs. Its range reached deep into enemy territory, and its payload made it the heavy hitter of the Allied fleet. Still, the Liberator wasn't easy to love. Pilots cursed it on the ground. It was heavy, stubborn, and rolled like a refrigerator with wings. Yet once it lifted off, it could climb into the heavens and hold its own. As war spread across Europe, the demand for bombers skyrocketed. In 1941, Ford Motor Company joined the effort, building a massive facility in Michigan, the Willow Run plant. Henry Ford called it the arsenal of democracy. Inside, tens of thousands of men and women worked day and night, assembling the Liberator piece by piece. Sparks flew from welding torches. Engines thundered on test stands. Oil and sweat filled the air. At its peak, Willow Run produced a complete B-24 every 63 minutes. It was an industrial miracle, proof that America's factories could fight wars as fiercely as its soldiers. A test pilot once said that first seeing a finished Liberator was like standing beside a ship that decided to grow wings. The aircraft stretched 67 feet long, with a wingspan of 110 feet. It carried 10 men, 10 machine guns, and up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. And when those 4 Pratt & Whitney engines fired together, the ground trembled like an approaching storm. By 1942, the B-24 was ready for war. It first saw combat in the deserts of North Africa, flying long missions against Axis convoys. Then it appeared over occupied France, Germany, and Italy. Its endurance turned missions once thought impossible into grimly routine operations. Crews nicknamed it the Flying Coffin, not out of disrespect, but because its narrow fuselage left little room to move or to escape when things went wrong. Flying a B-24 wasn't for the faint of heart. Takeoff alone was a struggle. Its heavy frame demanded long runways, and any misjudgment could send it skidding off the edge. Once airborne, the controls felt sluggish, like wrestling a stubborn animal. Yet in combat, it proved its worth. It was fast enough to keep formation and strong enough to bring its crew home on half its engines. The Ploiești raid in August 1943 tested those limits more than ever. The mission's goal: cripple Hitler's main oil supply and starve his war machine. The plan was daring: a low-level attack flying just a few hundred feet above the ground to avoid radar. The crews trained for months in the hot Nevada desert, flying over mock oil fields built to mimic the Romanian landscape. They knew the odds were terrible, but they went anyway. When the formation crossed the Danube River that morning, German anti-aircraft guns opened up. Flak tore through the sky. Liberators exploded midair. Others pressed on, engines blazing, wings riddled with holes. Smoke from burning refineries rose, so high it engulfed the bombers themselves. One pilot recalled later, "The fire reached the clouds. We flew through hell, and some of us stayed there." Out of 177 aircraft that took off, 53 never returned. Over 500 airmen were killed or captured. Yet the mission left a mark that no statistic could measure. The Ploiești oil fields were devastated. Even though production eventually recovered, the psychological impact on both sides was enormous. For the Germans, it was proof that nowhere was safe. For the Americans, it showed that courage could carry them into the jaws of death, and sometimes back out again. On the ground, German officers stared upward in disbelief. Reports from Luftwaffe anti-aircraft units described the first encounters in near-reverent tones. "They came in waves," one commander wrote, "like silver locusts across the sun." He wasn't exaggerating. The B-24s flew so low that their propellers kicked up dust and debris, shredding trees and rooftops. Anti-air guns overheated from constant fire. Even the most disciplined crews panicked at the sight of those endless formations. To them, it felt like a new kind of war, one where the enemy didn't creep over the horizon, but arrived all at once, blotting out the sky. For years, the Luftwaffe had ruled those same skies. Now it was the hunted. "We are no longer fighting pilots," one German flyer said bitterly. "We are fighting factories." The irony of the name Liberator wasn't lost on anyone. It liberated cities by reducing them to rubble. It freed nations through destruction. But in the twisted logic of war, that was liberation indeed. Back at the Allied bases, the mood was somber. Crews that returned from Ploiești limped home on 3 engines, sometimes 2. Wings were shredded, fuselages burned, but the planes still flew. One of them landed with over 700 bullet holes, and every crew member alive. Another, out of fuel, glided into a wheat field and slid to a stop, silent, smoking, but intact. The Liberator had lived up to its name in the only way it knew how, surviving the impossible. Letters from the men who flew them paint a clearer picture than any statistic could. One bombardier wrote to his mother the night before a mission, "If I don't make it back, tell Dad not to worry. It's not fear that keeps me awake. It's the engines. They never stop humming, even when I try to sleep." Another airman scribbled in his journal after Ploiești, "We thought the world would end in fire, and it almost did, but we kept flying through it because someone had to." By the end of 1943, the Germans had learned to fear the outline of AB, 24 on the horizon. It was the sound of industry turned into thunder. The once invincible Luftwaffe struggled to keep up. Their fighters, stretched thin, couldn't stop the swarms that poured over Europe day after day. For every bomber they downed, 2 more arrived. The Reich cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Frankfurt, trembled under their shadows. Pilots still joked about their ungainly machines, calling them flying boxcars or ugly ducklings. But behind the humor was a strange affection. The Liberator was unforgiving, but it was faithful. It brought thousands of men home who had no right to be alive. One veteran summed it up decades later. "You didn't fly the B-24. You made a deal with it, and if you kept your end, she'd keep hers." As 1943 came to a close, the Liberator had earned its place in the war's brutal mythology. It wasn't the prettiest plane nor the easiest to fly, but it was relentless, and that was enough. In Germany, officers began reporting mass damage to oil depots, rail yards, and factories. "They're everywhere," one Luftwaffe commander wrote in his log. They come by day, and the night is not long enough to rebuild. The war in the air had changed. The hunter was now the hunted, but the Liberator's greatest test was still ahead. The skies over Europe were growing deadlier by the week, and what waited beyond the horizon would push both the aircraft and its crews to their absolute limit. The engines fade into the distance as the narrator's voice softens. The Liberator had arrived, and the world below would never look at the sky the same way again. The year was 1944, and the sky itself seemed to have joined the war. From the white cliffs of Dover to the iron factories of the Ruhr, the horizon was crisscrossed with contrails, thin, ghostly scars of battle. On some days, the sun over Europe never shone at all. It was hidden behind thousands of engines, wings, and burning oil. Soldiers on the ground used to say that when the B-24 Liberators flew overhead, it felt like the sky was falling in slow motion. For the men who flew them, the world had narrowed to 10 men, 1 aircraft, and 1,000 miles of enemy airspace. Each crew member knew his role by heart. The pilot's hands trembled slightly on the yoke. The navigator hunched over his charts by a red bulb. The bombardier waited for the bomb bay doors open with that same dry taste of adrenaline in his mouth. The gunner, crouched inside a transparent bubble of plexiglass, could see death coming from every direction. And all of them listened to the same sound, the relentless hum of 4 Pratt and Whitney engines, steady as a heartbeat and just as fragile. By 1944, the B-24 was no longer a curiosity. It was an empire of metal in the sky. There were thousands of them now, factories like Ford's Willow Run running day and night to produce a bomber every hour. The German war machine had begun to falter under this constant rain of steel. The Luftwaffe, once arrogant and fearless, now fought a war of exhaustion. Even ace pilots admitted that the waves never seemed to end. One German officer wrote bitterly, "We shoot 1 down, and the next day 10 more arrive. It is like trying to stop a storm with our hands." But for the crews, victory came at a staggering cost. On average, a bomber crew's life expectancy was 15 missions. 15. The odds were cruelly simple. Every sortie was a roll of dice between glory and oblivion. At 20,000 feet, temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. Frost formed on oxygen masks. Gun barrels froze, and blood turned sluggish in the veins. A burst of flak could turn the fuselage into a coffin within seconds. And yet, they climbed back in day after day. One gunner described the routine with dry humor. Breakfast at 4, briefing at 5, scared to death by 6. Another recalled the strange beauty of it all, watching dawn rise over the channel, sunlight bouncing off the wings of hundreds of bombers. It looked peaceful, he said softly, until the fighters showed up. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at them, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even rocket interceptors toward the end. The sky became a battlefield of black puffs and fireballs. Pilots learned to recognize the sound of flak shrapnel tearing through aluminum, the whistle of a falling shell, the sudden silence that meant an engine was gone. Inside the B-24, the intercoms crackled with calm voices masking raw terror. Number 3's hit. Feather the prop. Keep formation. In that suspended world between earth and heaven, discipline was survival. Then came the great raids of 1944, Berlin, Hamburg, Regensburg, the Ruhr industrial belt. Cities that had once glowed with German confidence now glowed with fire. The raids were massive beyond imagination. A single mission could involve 2,000 aircraft, filling the sky from horizon to horizon. From above, the bombers looked like glimmering fish moving in shoals. From below, they looked like Judgment Day, when the B-24s and their sister B-17s flew together. The Germans knew what was coming. Sirens wailed across cities. Civilians rushed to bunkers. Children pressed their hands over their ears as the world roared. For every factory destroyed, thousands of lives were scattered. And still, the bombers kept coming. The crews joked that the only thing louder than the engines was the fear. But humor was the best defense against madness. Some even gave their planes names that border on irony. Lucky Lady, Heavenly Body, No Time for Sergeants. A few painted cartoon characters on the nose. Donald Duck holding a bomb, or Betty Grable smiling above a row of swastikas. The humor made the fear bearable, and sometimes it fooled them into courage. There were days, though, when courage wasn't enough. The Schweinfurt, Regensburg mission in 1943 had already proven that unescorted bombers were slaughtered. In early 1944, when the Allies began to introduce long-range P-51 Mustangs as escorts, everything changed. The sleek fighters appeared beside the lumbering Liberators like guardian angels armed with machine guns. The bomber crews loved them instantly. One pilot later said, "Seeing a Mustang out your window was like spotting an angel with a cigar." With fighter cover overhead, the Liberators pressed deeper into enemy territory. No city was out of reach now. Not Berlin, not Vienna, not even the fortified submarine pens along the Atlantic coast. The Germans could not stop them all. The Reich's factories slowed, its oil supply dwindled, its armies began to starve of fuel. Every gallon of gasoline burned by a Panzer became a small miracle, and miracles were running out. Meanwhile, far away in the Pacific, the B-24 was writing another chapter of its legend. Its longer range made it perfect for island-hopping warfare. From bases in the Philippines and Australia, it struck Japanese convoys, airfields, and even the oil fields of Borneo. The Liberator's nickname there was a Pacific Ghost, because it could appear over targets thousands of miles away, vanish into the ocean mist, and return hours later. In both hemispheres, it became the relentless symbol of Allied reach. One of its strangest stories, though, came from the desert. In 1943, a B-24 named Lady Be Good disappeared returning from a mission over Libya. No trace was found during the war. 15 years later, in 1958, oil surveyors discovered the wreck deep in the Sahara. The crew had parachuted out, thinking they were near base, but they were hundreds of miles off course. Their skeletons were found scattered across the sand, still carrying ration cans and flares. Even in death, they told a story of endurance. Back in Europe, the German people began to feel the war closing in from above. The diaries of civilians speak in trembling words. "We live underground now," wrote one woman from Hamburg. "The nights are made of fire. The days smell of smoke." Children drew pictures of airplanes with black rain falling from their bellies. In that rain, history was being rewritten one explosion at a time. A Luftwaffe pilot later recalled his helplessness. "We climbed to intercept them, but there were too many. You could shoot down one, maybe two, and there would still be hundreds. It was like trying to kill the sky." His words were not exaggeration. By late 1944, American bombers filled the heavens by the thousands. Even the mighty German air defense, once the pride of Europe, had been ground down to dust. Yet inside those bombers, the cost was measured not in victories, but in faces. Crews changed constantly, replacements fresh from training schools joining survivors who had seen too much. The jokes grew darker, the good luck rituals stranger. Some kissed a bullet before takeoff. Others tucked photographs into the control panel. One crewman wrote a note to his wife before every flight, folded it into his jacket pocket, and burned it if he came back. He burned dozens. In the final winter of the war, as the Allies pushed across the Rhine, the B-24 squadrons flew missions that blurred into one another. Hamburg on Monday, Dresden on Thursday, Berlin on Sunday. The sky was no longer a place of glory. It was a factory floor for death. Pilots watched German cities vanish under clouds of smoke, and sometimes even they wondered what liberation really meant. Still, there was no turning back. The logic of war was merciless. Destroy now to save later. Each bombing run shortened the war, weakened the enemy, saved lives somewhere else. That's what they told themselves. And perhaps, in the cruel mathematics of history, they were right. Then came the end. Spring 1945. Germany collapsing. The skies that once thundered with liberators now echoed with silence. The surviving aircraft returned to England in waves, landing one after another on muddy runways. For many crews, it was their last flight. They stepped down, looked at the machines that had carried them through hell, and patted the metal as though it were alive. Some cried. Some simply walked away without a word. Within months, thousands of B-24s were scrapped. Perfectly good planes were cut apart with torches, melted down for peacetime industry. A few were sold for pennies. Others were left to rust in remote airfields. for a generation that had lived inside them. It was like watching comrades die quietly after the war was already over. But memories are harder to melt. In old letters, diaries, and interviews, the voices of those who flew the Liberator still hum like its engines. It was ugly, one veteran admitted, but it got us home, and that's all that mattered. Another said simply, she was a hard ship to love, but easy to respect. Numbers tell part of the story. More than 18,000 B-24s built, the most of any heavy bomber in history. Over 200,000 men served aboard them. Tens of thousands never came back. But those who did carried something unspoken, a bond between man and machine that only war could forge. Even the enemy remembered. After the war, a captured German officer told an Allied interrogator, "When we saw your bombers, we knew the end had begun." That simple confession might have been the Liberator's truest legacy. In the years that followed, the world moved on. Jet engines replaced propellers. Guided missiles replaced bomb sites, and the skies grew quieter. The B-24 became a museum piece, a memory. But sometimes on summer air shows or veterans gatherings, one of the few surviving Liberators still takes to the air. Its engines rumble to life. Deep, rhythmic, almost human, and old men tilt their heads skyward. For a few seconds, they are 19 again, squinting into the sun, tasting the smell of oil and cordite, feeling the vibration in their bones. The narrator's voice softens as the aircraft climbs out of sight. Once, there were thousands of them. They filled the sky, darkened the sun, and burned the night. They carried courage, fear, and the fate of nations in their wings. They were the storm that ended a tyranny. And then, almost as an afterthought, they called it the Liberator. And for a world held hostage by fear, that name was no exaggeration. The engines fade into the distance, leaving only silence, the kind of silence that follows thunder.